Change is inevitable. One could even argue the gaming industry is the most obvious example of this. Sometimes, these changes are cyclical. Just take fighting games and JRPGs. Both genres were pretty much dead at one point in time, but now they're experiencing a renaissance. The mascot platformer had its day in the sun during the mid-90s through early 2000s, and have basically become non-existent with a few exceptions. Why do I bring up mascot platformers though? It's because a very vocal segment of the PlayStation fanbase have been begging for the return of Jak and Daxter, Sly Cooper, and many others after PlayStation made references to them in Astro Bot, which harkens back to those games, not just in terms of genre and references, but the overall feel of it. How does that relate to the title of this video about fixing PlayStation though? It's simple really, that's partially how PlayStation can fix the issues it's currently facing. I've covered in a few other videos how PlayStation's average fanbase is in their late 20s to early 30s, meaning by gaming standards, it's an aging demographic that, generally speaking, are no longer the target demographics of video games. Generally speaking, video games are still targeted towards a younger audience, despite there being M-rated titles. It's an issue that hasn't been cracked by industry experts, and yet the answer is super simple. Make games for all types of audiences and don't niche down like PlayStation has done for the better part of a decade. So picture the modern PlayStation lineup of exclusives. What comes to mind? The vast majority of their games are cinematic third-person experiences. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but I have covered why in a previous video why I'm burnt out on this type of game, and I find them a bit boring at this stage. The general gaming public seems to agree with me as well. Now, PlayStation saw the bottom falling out on this type of gaming experience during the tail end of Jim Ryan's tenure, so they tried to pivot into producing live service titles, which has been a tremendous failure. Just look at how bad Concord did. According to some reports, it cost $400 million to produce. More conservative reports have said it lost Sony $200 million. Either way, that's not a good look, and Firewalk Studios shuttered in October of 2024. One of the biggest issues for Sony pivoting so hard into live service games was the fact there wasn't really a transitional period between the cinematic styling the fans had come to expect and the live service games Sony was peddling. Concord was the closest attempt to this, but ultimately it was presented like a generic, albeit decent to look at, hero shooter, a genre that's already on death's door as people got sick of it after playing Overwatch and Apex for the better part of a decade. Concord really lacked a concrete reason to latch onto, as most of the characters were very generic. However, this isn't an issue that's just common to the Jim Ryan tenure. During the PS1, the majority of the in-house PlayStation exclusives were things like Crash and Spyro and other mascot platformers, which continued into the 2000s. Before we entered the early 2010s, the mascot platformer was dead, just like all the fathers Christian Cage goes after in his AEW promos.
Rude to make me talk over you, so I'd appreciate a little decorum here, please, Milwaukee. Shut your damn mouth!
It was thanks to the death of the mascot platformer that PlayStation had a bit of an identity problem during the PlayStation 3 era. Like I alluded to earlier in the video, traditional JRPGs were dead as well, which was the other core pillar of PlayStation to this point in time. This was when we started seeing them dabbling with more cinematic experiences like the Uncharted games, which felt like a breath of fresh air as they were paying homage to the B-grade adventure films. You also had the likes of Infamous, which paid homage to cheesy, gritty, and over-the-top indie comics of the 1980s. Seriously, Infamous would be such a great vehicle to deconstruct the superhero genre at this point in time. Of the mascot platformers, only Ratchet and Clank survived, but it made perfect sense given that franchise has always been a homage to animated films from the likes of Pixar and DreamWorks, meaning the series actually benefited from the shift towards a more cinematic style. Games like Sly Cooper, Jak and Daxter, etc. were left unused as they no longer fit in with the gaming landscape at the time, nor did they fit with Sony's more cinematic vision, though one could argue, given how Sly Cooper was meant to feel like a Saturday morning cartoon, whilst paying homage to heist films, could have benefited from a shift to a more cinematic style, which we sort of saw as of the right now final Sly Cooper game to date, which is titled Thieves in Time. I'll say this though, given Astro Bot's strong sales, nomination for Game of the Year, and some other things I know, just wait. We're going to see the revival of some some PlayStation classics in the future. But how has niching down hurt the PlayStation brand exactly? Simply put, PlayStation forgot what gaming is supposed to be about, actually being fun. They also forgot an old adage that every company involved in the entertainment industry seems to have forgotten. Variety is the spice of life. Don't believe me? Just look at the music and film industries. Both find a cash cow, milk it for all it's worth, and make people hate that style of music or movie for a long time before reviving the genre in some way, because just like fashion, music, movies, and video games are all cyclical. At present, we're starting to see a 90s revival in the games industry, and considering that's when I entered the gaming space, I'm all for it. But ultimately, we're going to need Sony to realize, hey, maybe we should be producing all types of games to attract the largest possible audience. Is this likely to happen? Probably not, given Sony is still the #1 name when it comes to the big three. Even though the Switch is just shy of the PlayStation 2 in terms of all-time sales, that console was intended to compete with the PS4, not the PS5. The Switch 2, on the other hand, is meant to compete with the PS5, and even though I will get one, let's just say, I have my doubts on if Nintendo can capture lightning in a bottle twice. Just look at how badly they bungled the Wii U after the success that was the Wii. But considering the PS5 is at this point in time the clear winner of the current generation of hardware, it's doubtful PlayStation is going to do too much in terms of their overall game plan. Despite the fact sales for cinematic games are down and their foray into live service failed, my bet is they'll see how well Astro did, will give those of us who love platformers a few bones, while also pumping out cinematic games by the truckload, which will make some fans a little happier, but it's not the right move. The right move is to make a couple of platformers, buy a few Japanese studios that focus on JRPGs, while also continuing to pump out the odd cinematic game, and then maybe 1 or 2 live service titles. That way, they aren't entirely relying on third-party companies to make a mix of games that will make the console more appealing to not just hardcore gamers, but also the casuals and normies too. Seriously, if Sony got smart and realized they need to leverage the vast amount of studios they have at their disposal to make a variety of games, they'd make the PlayStation brand not just sustainable for the here and now, but also well into the future. Part of why they should pivot to a diverse stable of games is because then none of their products will feel entirely the same, which is a good thing. I'm going to bring up wrestling again real quick to make my point. Under the evil Vince McMahon, the WWE favored guys who were over 6 foot and a certain weight threshold, giving the smaller guys the shaft. It got to a point all the talent on both the men's and women's side were rather cookie cutter. For the women, it was your stereotypical busty blondes. Now that the company is handled by a different group and an entirely different creative team, talents are starting to be a little more diverse, and wrestlers who would have previously been stuck in the lower and mid cards for life are actually getting the pushes they deserve. Want to give my channel the push it deserves? Hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Sony now has the same opportunity under Herman Hulst and Hideki Nishino as co-CEOs. If both men are smart, they'll listen to the likes of Ted Price, who has said the modern AAA game cannot sustain itself anymore as they have to sell millions of units just to be profitable, whereas something like Astrobot only needed to sell 1.5 million copies and was extremely profitable. That's not to say the big budget cinematic games aren't also profitable either. Just look at Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. That sold 2.7 million copies worldwide and made 145 million off a budget of 81 million by the time you include marketing costs. While neither seems like a smashing success, you have to consider this. Astrobot as a whole hasn't established itself as a household name in the gaming industry. There's also the fact it's exclusive to PlayStation, and while the PS5 is the 13th best-selling system of all time when this is being recorded, that's pretty impressive, as are the sales of Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart when you consider that game was from the first year of the PS5's life cycle, so it didn't have a high number of units out in the wild. Plus, it was still really hard to get a PS5 at that point in time, thanks to scalpers and supply chain issues thanks to the pandemic. It also goes to show, make good games and people will buy them. That, along with targeting gamers whose needs aren't being met. Seriously, how many really good 3D platformers can you name off the top of your head in the last decade or so? The ones I can think of are A Hat in Time, the Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy, Spyro Reignited Trilogy, Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time, and now Astro Bot. The pool of good 3D platformers is so shallow it makes the kiddie pool look like a fucking ocean. So clearly PlayStation fans want platformers, and a lot of fans do still want cinematic games. The majority would rather spend their money on third-party live service games. So how can Sony make all of these gamers in the PlayStation camp happy? It's so simple it doesn't take a market analyst to see how to fix the issue, and I'm surprised these so-called expert eggheads have yet to figure it out. You get a bunch of developers to work on low-budget platformers and other experimental titles that, hey, if they find a solid audience, that's great, and if they don't, well, no big loss, as you're losing only a few million at most compared to hundreds of millions. Acquire a few Japanese developers who have a proven ability to produce quality games on small budgets and market the hell out of them to the weebs.
Oops, I'm breaking the fourth wall.
Keep the cinematic games that are your current bread and butter, though maybe look to make some new IPs within this section. That way, burnout will be less and you make fewer of them. Then for the crowd who want live service games, give them a few experimental ones on the lower budget side, and incorporate a robust multiplayer into the cinematic games just like you did with the PS3. That way it's there for the people that want a live service title, but those who just want to play a good single player game and a multiplayer they can casually play are also happy. Sometimes finding a compromise is the best solution, especially when you consider how PlayStation would be seeing the benefits of both worlds by combining a cinematic game with live service elements. That's kind of what Bandai Namco achieved with Tekken 8, and look how well received that game is, bar a few people who were salty over not getting a new stage as part of the season pass. By appeasing the cinematic people, they ensure the fan base they've built up over the past generation sticks around, and by using an older method that was working about a decade ago, they're kind of bringing in the audience Jim Ryan wanted without alienating anyone. Hell, PlayStation as a brand even have two IPs that pretty much could have been utilized in the combined cinematic and live service roles perfectly. I'm of course talking about Resistance and Twisted Metal. I've previously covered how Resistance would have been the perfect IP to explore this idea, so click the card on screen now if that video interests you. As for Twisted Metal, Firesprite was apparently working on one, which was cancelled. Now I've personally heard Sony just moved it to another studio who has experience in working on single-player campaigns, so I don't believe for a second this project has been canned, considering they let crap like Concord through. My bet is Firesprite had the game in a mostly playable state, but egregious monetization practices meant it needed to be heavily reworked, along with having a single-player component added on, so that's one to pay attention to. Sony could also leverage IPs like Killzone for a hybrid of cinematic and live service, since first-person shooters lend well to both. Seriously, how is it that a small YouTuber like myself figured out how to fix all of the issues facing the PlayStation brand when one of their executives, who are supposed to be the experts here, can't figure this stuff out? Seriously though, if PlayStation play their cards right, they can get a younger audience in at the ground floor with platformers and similar games. They can appease the weebs while also appealing to the cinematic and normie crowds by making their lineup more diverse. But do you think PlayStation can fix things, or do you think they're cooked and we're in the dying days of PlayStation? Comment below. Thanks go out to my current channel members, R. Campbell and Danny Boy. If you'd like to support the channel further by getting early access to most of my content and exclusive videos, you can do so by hitting the join button or the link in the description. Now check out Why Resistance Needs to Return or my video on why cinematic games are boring. Until next time, keep blazing that trail.